Peace, Mike Delgadio here, back with another video on home studio setup for voiceover. Except today it's not really home studio setup, but I do know that many of the folks who watch this channel are interested in getting started doing voice acting for video games. So I thought I would bring on a special guest for us today who has that expertise and is hopefully willing to share some of that with us. Please welcome to the show, Julia Bianco Schoeffling. Julia serves as the COO and a casting director for the Halp Network, where she specializes specifically in casting in voice and performance capture casting for video games. She's also the author of sort of the book on voice acting for video games. It's called The Art and Business of Acting for Video Games. And finally, she's also heavily involved with an upcoming conference that you folks may be interested in called Soundcon, which is a conference specifically around sound for video games. And this year, the conference has a specific track for voice acting and dialogue in that conference. And Julie is part of the group. She's been largely responsible for putting together that track to help get voice actors into video games and to help them understand sort of everything that's involved. So I thought it'd be really cool to have Julia on. Julia, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. Before we get started, I mentioned in the introduction that there's an upcoming conference called the Soundcon. And this is the first year that they're going to have a track specifically for voice acting and dialogue. And you were the person who put that track together. Could you give us a little bit of a sense of what the conference is, what a voice actor can expect from that conference?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Mike, and thanks for having me. Soundcon is a conference that is the only conference about game audio, or the largest conference about game audio in the world. And it's happening on October 17th and 18th. Typically, audio directors, audio folks from around the game industry, including people who work on casting and dialogue and performance, convene during these 2 days to talk about audio specifically. And there's been a growing interest in the dialogue track for actors to kind of hear what developers have to say and to be up on the greatest and latest technology. And so this year we introduced something called the Actor Pass. It's just the second half of the second day. And we're curating all of our panels to be specifically relevant to actors as well as the developers. And then right at the very end, we're going to have an actual mixer so that actors can meet with developers directly and talk to them about what they're looking for. So it's pretty exciting.
The company that you founded is called the Halp Network. And that's a company that does voice and performance capture and casting. You do a lot of casting for video games. For those who have never worked in a video game before, can you sort of paint a thumbnail of what a casting director does? Where does your role fit in the video game voice acting world?
Yeah, we're relatively new as a concept in video games because basically video game performance came a lot out of the people making the games from original when they were originally making the games. So the developers would be in their games, whether it would be the animators acting out a scene and then rotoscoping over it, or it would be the secretary or the receptionist playing all the female roles in all of the temp dialogue for anything that you did. So as the needs of dialogue and the breadth of dialogue has expanded in these games and the kind of the needs for casting has expanded, there's finally become kind of a place for casting directors, but there's still not very many of us. A lot of times in the past and kind of the in-between, the voice directors would do the casting. So they would do all the casting and then the directing. But the volume has really kind of necessitated a casting director kind of in that position.
And I'm sure just with the size of video games, what they've become, just the scope of the number of people that are involved, I'm sure being able to sort of run interference for the folks making the game, I'm sure it helps.
Oh, absolutely.
Do you primarily, are you working with actors individually? Do you mostly go with agencies? Like how do people find you to get their audition to you? Or how does that phase of it work?
The number one question, right? No, it's a great question, and it's all over the place. It's not standardized. There are tiny little games, indie developers that are still voicing their own games. And in terms of actors, trying to connect with those. A lot of times those connections happen directly. They happen on the internet. They happen through fan connections. There's all sorts of ways that happen. As budgets grow,
at game sound conferences,
game
maybe.
sound conferences, maybe. As the kind of, depending on the need and the type of actor, the casting process would be a little bit different. So sometimes people cast off of demo reels for a lot of mobile games and smaller games, or games that have a ton of bit parts. They'll listen to a demo reel and say, okay, that person can handle 3 roles, and then we'll typically provide like 3 demo reels per character, and then the client would select from there. Those are amazing because you don't actually have to audition for them. It's not all the time. Those demo reels we either have on file, we get from agents, or we have relationships with actors directly. That would be almost exclusively non-union that happens.
Interesting. Okay.
A union jobs will typically go out and do their own casting. And do more custom casting. And in those cases, we are going to the agents directly, usually about 10 to 15 agencies. But we also, I find it's very important to keep up with who is out there, regardless if they have agents. So I'm always out there teaching. I'm always out there going to events like, VO Atlanta and things like that, so that I can meet the community and make sure I'm not missing anything in anyone.
Do you find that there's more non-union work than union work? Is it a 50-50 split? How does that shake out?
The traditional number is 80% non-union.
Is that right?
And that is because of a bunch of different reasons. One of which is that there's a lot of international developers. It's a very international community. And that's just not something that is dealt with much over in international communities. And so when contracting and master services agreements and all of those things come into place, there's not a lot of room for adding in a 30-page union document that they must abide by.
Right.
And then the other piece is because of these developer actors. Because when you have a team of developers that have worked on a project for 3 years, and a couple of those voices stay in the game, that is
starts as a scratch track and becomes the character.
Taft-Hartleying every time. It's not really. So it's those are 2 of the main reasons: cost, ownership of assets, all sorts of other things. There's a big difference in the usage too, in terms of these games. Because a lot of times, and things are changing now with games that live on, but a lot of games were made and then put in the bargain bin 2 months later. You're not really playing too many games from 2 years ago, And so it's not like film and TV where there's this ages and ages of syndication. That's not how it is. And then the games that are living, they're constantly being updated. So that's ongoing work for those actors. So it's a really different kind of market, community, everything, industry.
So you have a book called the Art and Business of Voice Acting for Video Games. There you go. Give you the plug. I certainly want to. Is this the kind of information that people would find in that book? I hate to have you retread everything that's in your book. Is that
no,
if
great.
People were looking to get educated, to start to prepare? As a voice actor, I'm always saying, I'm a voice actor. And the first thing people say is, what video games are you in? Or, boy, I would love to be a voice actor for video games. Is your book sort of like the primer for voice actors who want to get in there? Where does your book fit in?
Actors are actors. And so it's not just about voice acting, because we do motion capture, performance capture, on-camera stuff too. My book was intended to describe the words that are unfamiliar, the topics that are unfamiliar, the history of the industry. So it's not so weird when you see that the developer is also in the game, and just kind of understanding some of the culture and why certain things are the way they are. I thought it would be really helpful for actors to have a tool in their toolbox that talked about games, and I didn't see anything that existed. And honestly, I would teach, and I do teach often, and the first 20 minutes to hour is education on just games. And I felt like it was such a waste of all of our time for me to be spending it on something that you could read about. And so I spent
Sure.
the pandemic late nighting writing it because I wanted it out there.
Yeah, and in the landscape, I think, certainly as me as a commercial voice actor, the landscape changed so much. There was been such just a sea change in the way I think the voice acting industry in general works from 2020 to 2024. It's a whole different world. So having a document or a primer, or a guide, somebody to hold your hand through what does this new world look like? I think that's
Thank you. I hope so. That's literally, I did it to be helpful. I just want to help. I want to make it a little bit easier. I don't want to gatekeep. I wanted it to be accessible. Very passionate about uplifting underrepresented actors and actors that may not have access to all of the things. It can be very expensive. VO can get a little culty. And it can get very expensive to do classes and to feel like you're in the community and committed. And I just wanted to demystify some of the things too that like I think come from only being around actors and not around people who hire.
You talked about underrepresented folks having access to sort of a coach, as it were, an asynchronous coach to help bring new talent in, because the industry is, they want as many new and varied voices as they can. So I think it's great that you can create something that doesn't put up those artificial barriers. I mean, yeah, there's technological barriers that we kind of just have to deal with. I'm not sure how to get past that from a home studio perspective, but being able to encourage people to try to develop their skills, to build a little studio in the corner of their basement so they can get these gigs, and helping them understand. I think your book, if I recall correctly, it's got chapters on like what should your home studio include if you want to work for video games. Does it also go into things like what to expect in a directed session?
Yes, yeah. So a little bit about my background is I studied recording arts before going to school for. Not going to school for. I went to school for recording arts before graduating and going to Treyarch, the Call of Duty developer. And I worked there for 5 years, actually through college and then after college. And I managed all of their dialogue, handled all of their sessions there. And my journey through that means that I'm very particular about my audio perspective. And because of that, I think that I have a very unique view, and especially in the book, about gear and what sounds good. Because when I'm listening to auditions, I'm listening like the sound designer, the audio director, not necessarily like the writer. And I think I will often make sure to comment on things like roominess and mic quality. I mean, we could have a whole conversation just about how game VO should really be done on cardioid mics. We shouldn't be doing shotgun mic auditions with game VO. And that's probably one of the most common things. And look, we don't want to have too many mics sometimes, and that's okay. And we all start somewhere. But if you're really hitting those auditions, 30, 40, 50 a week, and you're doing it on a shotgun, like you're killing yourself for no reason.
Yeah, it's, and that's a really interesting perspective, because I just interviewed Chuck Duran. I don't know if you know Chuck. I interviewed Chuck Duran, and he's like, the 416. The 416 is the magic mic for commercials. And it's got a very different and particular sound. Whereas for voice, for video games, I would imagine the cardioid microphone being much more neutral, much more lifelike. It doesn't sound like a radio jock or like you're trying to cut through the mix, so to speak. Having something that sounds neutral would be really important. Are there mics that you like that are maybe in budgets? Are there ones that you're familiar with that you're like, yeah, this is generally good?
The TLM 103 is the industry standard. It used to be the U87, but it's not necessarily one that is boothable, right? It's the one that's in most of the studios.
Yeah.
But the TLM is like a really nice it's still expensive. I believe there's a Gefell that's also kind of in there too that some folks really like. I have a Rode NT USB, and it totally works for the minimum stuff. And again, I'm not an actor and I'm not trying to book jobs, but it
Sure.
sounds great on here, right? So there's baby steps.
I think, I talk a lot about gear on my channel, and what's been very nice about maybe the last decade is that the quality of what you can expect for the consumer grade audio has really come up quite a bit in the past few years. And the Rode NT1, it's a very it's a nice neutral mic. If you can put it in the right room, it can sound very, very natural. And the TLM 103, also a great mic, a third the cost of the U87, and it has really just the features that the voice actor would need. So that's those are good.
Yeah, I mean, I advise not to go to the upgraded microphone until you can have the upgraded room, because we know that the moment you upgrade that microphone, your room sounds like not very good.
For sure.
But yeah, it's there's a lot of that stuff in the book, and I have a lot of opinions on kind of also starting off with your iPhone is totally fine, and especially if you are in an area where you can go into a studio like in LA or in New York. A lot of games are still bringing people in.
Is that right?
It's not required. What at least from my perspective, what we try to do is leave it open because of accessibility. And equity. We don't want to make it so that you have to live within 50 miles of LA to book this job. Right. We don't want to make it that you have to have a $3,000 home studio to book this job. So just trying to find the balance there, depending on the role and the client's tolerance for that.
For sure. And, in markets like New York and LA, a lot of times the housing is prohibitive that you can't put a good sounding booth, right? I have friends who are in Brooklyn, for example. They're like, it's never quiet. Even if I had a whisper room, it's never quiet enough in Brooklyn for me to be able to record. Do you sit in on the sessions, the recording sessions, like when people are actually doing the recording? Have you sat in on some of those sessions?
I don't anymore, but I've probably sat in maybe 3,000, 4,000 hours of sessions.
So you're just getting started with it. My question was going to be around when people are in the studio. Like I've done, I've gone into the studio, I've done directed sessions for commercials, but that's often you have lots of time. I might only be recording 30 or 40 or 50 seconds worth of audio, but I have a 2-hour session in which to capture that. And we'll do 40 takes of the commercial. My very limited experience with voice acting for video games is that you got to get 3 good takes, and you got to be prepared to really get through that script fast. Is there an etiquette or an expectation of what people should think about when they're in a session with a live director?
I wouldn't say etiquette or expectation, because I think that will put a little pressure on folks, especially for newer folks. And I don't think that that's necessarily true. The pros, Steve Blooms, can do 200 lines in 20 minutes. Insane. Right. But also probably on a project he's done for 10 years, and he just knows that voice, and they're not trying to get nuanced breaths and things like that for a cinematic. It just kind of depends. We say about 50 lines an hour is a good gauge for recording. And those lines are about 10 words or less. But that's a quick pace. It's a quick pace. And so our engineers are highly trained too. That's why a lot of times we prefer working with our own engineers, training our own engineers, because they're really quick. They can edit on the fly. They can pull takes. They can play back. They can do everything very quickly. And it's, luckily not what you need to do.
Is it usually is it 3 takes? Do you normally do let's do 3 of that?
If it's vocally stressful, we reduce that. We're trying to pull back on the 3 takes unless necessary. So usually it's 1 and an alt. And we have to be really careful about too much shouting or projected work.
Right. I remember it was a few years ago where there was a lot of swirl around, voice actors just tearing themselves apart during these really intense recording sessions. Has that you feel like that's pulled back a bit?
I think there's been a lot more awareness on the developer side of that, and then on the actor side to advocate for themselves. It's like a voice is like a muscle, and if you pull a muscle, there's no one that can tell the team that you pulled a muscle unless it's you. So it really requires advocacy for yourself, and it's really hard when you're in a position where you're trying to do a service and then you find that you can't do the service. So I think everyone knowing that it's a thing has been so much better for the industry because everybody's aware of it and trying to navigate. We still have issues because every person is different.
Certainly with the training that goes along with it. Like, there are people who are well trained if they've been on stage and they have to learn how to project to the back row. Those of us who are not stage actors, we might not have the same level of training or facility with that muscle to be able to, like, I don't know how to do a heavy metal scream. I couldn't scream for more than 10 or 15 seconds without potentially, hurting my throat. Whereas other people know how to do it and they can scream for whole minutes, I suppose, if they had to, if not more.
We have scream teams. We literally have screamers, people who scream. And a lot of them are metal singers and have been trained to do it and do it in an effective way that doesn't, hurt themselves. So
because of the work that I do, screaming has not been.
That's okay.
I do it on very, very rare occasion. Yeah. So I've just never. That's not the muscle I've learned how to exercise. I know how to talk for several hours at a time. And try and be consistent that way. But, I've learned a different set of muscle memory, I suppose.
Well, with Halloween coming up, there will definitely be some creature classes at the Help Academy, which is my company's school. And there's definitely going to be some stuff about vocal craziness.
Very good. Very good. I was reading a different blog about a different thing altogether, a tech blog, and they were talking about the game audio pipeline. And they were talking about like the technical, like how you keep track of these huge scripts for technical purposes. But there was an interesting thing that hadn't occurred to me. Again, from the commercial work, my script is the script. You usually can't vary by a syllable, but they were talking about how the directors and the actors may polish the script like actual live during the session. Is there a fair bit of freedom, or does it vary by game? Like,
so
how much can people go off script?
Okay, that's a very different question. So I'm going to answer the first question.
Okay, sure. Okay.
And then we can answer that one. Scripts for games and even characters for games are not locked when we're casting. I did a role just 2 weeks ago where the ethnicity of the character changed halfway through casting. Okay. So things are constantly changing. And there's a lot of factors for that. Games are about iteration. And they spend years and years and years iterating to make things work. And you can have all the amazing performances in the world, but if the game doesn't play and if it's not fun, it's not going to be a good game.
Right.
So basically there'll be different phases where we engage talent, and depending on if you are doing motion and performance capture or VO, it will be different. And at those phases, the script will be in different places. But some of these scripts have 10, 50, 100,000 lines.
Wow.
And sometimes it's cinematic material that's a 23-minute cinematic, or sometimes it's the hundreds of thousands of lines of combinations of shouting out battle chatter or whatnot. Scripts are insanely fluid, and by basically the only time the script is locked is after it's recorded and when we are sending all of that information to the localization teams to do the translations. Because once it starts going into translation, the domino effect is insanely expensive. So if you make changes, the changes have to get reflected in the other languages, and that is not something that people want to pay for.
And so to voice actors, will there be callbacks or pickups? Like you record something, you think you think you've got it, and then does that work into the contract or something? How do you when you come back and do it again?
So sometimes there are pickups, and it would just be a new fee. Occasionally, they may ask for a shorter fee or a lower fee. If it's a shorter session, it's just one line. Can you come back in? It may be dependent on how many times you've engaged the actor. It may be, but sometimes you may just do one session, 2 hours or 5 lines and never see anything about it again.
Sure. Do you find that in addition to, are you casting for individual roles? Do you often cast for, we're looking for a guy or gal who can do 10 roles, 5 roles? Is it all over the place? How's that work?
Combination, especially with motion and performance capture. A lot of times they want likeness and they want some of these bigger celebrity folks. You're definitely going to only have one person playing one role for those. As the talent gets less recognizable, or if they can do a lot of stuff, we may ask people to do multiple things. Or if you have someone like Steve Bloom, who we were talking about before, if we have someone like Steve Bloom in the booth and we know he can do 3 roles and there's like some little one-liner, he may get thrown it in the booth anytime. That said, we do have different kind of arrangements for doing 8 and 10 voices. It's hard to get more than 3 distinct voices out of people, even when you can do a lot of voices.
That don't start to verge into cartoon, because it's really, if you get into cartoon, you can do a lot of different things, but it's hard to, as someone who's done like audiobooks, I know there's only so much that I can carry through for more than a couple of lines. That doesn't sound like me with my accent, with my tone of voice, with everything. So yeah, I can see that. I
wouldn't mind addressing a little bit of the mocap PCAP difference just to give it to y'all,
Sure.
Which is motion capture is typically body, and it's typically almost like a stunt thing. The stunt community, the stunt coordinators, the stunt hiring entities are typically the ones that go out and look for motion capture actors. Performance capture actors, and it's not actors, performances. They're looking for people to do motion capture, actors to do motion capture, and a lot of times those actors come from the stunt community. Performance capture is going to be the full performance. It's going to be facial capture, facial movement sometimes, like the dots on the face or a face cam with the headgear. It's going to be acting with your body in a volume, and they're going to be recording your voice. And I think something that's really interesting for actors who have an affinity for voiceover is that we often select voice actors who can act with their bodies. Actors who are proficient at voice acting, as well as theater, stage acting is a big kind of pipeline in these roles, because the voice is still the most important thing. Even though the body is driving this role, the likeness is not very important most of the time. Sometimes it's the voice. And then they're also going to have to do 3,000 lines in the booth after that stage day.
Interesting. So they're recording you're capturing the facial expression, I'm sure, so the animators can do their work. And they're saying the lines. Are you capturing them at studio quality in that situation? Is that right? So there's a bigger sound stage of some sort where you can do all of that.
Yes. If you Google any kind of performance capture from The Last of Us or Uncharted, they have a lot of stuff on YouTube about their performance capture sessions, and you can see a lot of the stuff happening.
And is it and this is all new to me, do you license your likeness in that case? Because I certainly know that there have been characters from video games, and I go, then you see the actor in real life, you're like, oh, wait, it looks that guy looks just like the character.
It depends. Sometimes the characters are created before and they cast someone that looks like it. Sometimes they scan and get exact likeness. And it is a negotiation point.
Yeah. Imagine that would be interesting. I'm thinking about it more from, for voice actors, there's a lot about AI and capturing our voice and being able to use our voices maybe in the long term, but I can imagine that also carries through for likenesses for the way you act or the look of a character that looks like you.
Personally, I believe the threat is much more minimal than the discussion. The amount that can be created from just AI on its own without you, as well as regular people who aren't actors who are willing to give their likeness and all sorts of stuff. Plus, like, how often do you play a video game and recognize someone, even if it's someone that's recognizable? And like, the uncanny valley still exists. And as much as I'd like to say that they look one-to-one, they still, you know.
Sure. Right.
So may you see your mole on some random video game character's eyebrow, possibly, but is that really threatening your future?
Right. You know, and I can't imagine that happens a lot. And I think, you know, there is a lot about AI, certainly from voices, that we certainly have to protect ourselves and our intellectual property that is our voice. But do you see that? Yes. Do you see in the near term that voice actors are going to be cut out of games just in their entirety? Like, is that in the near term?
No. I actually was really lucky to talk to the LA Times about this just a couple of weeks ago. Really, AI has always been used in games as a tool, and it will continue to be used as a tool. But to think that the one industry that has been working for the last 20 years to get more human wants to replace humans is just kind of, it means that you don't understand what you're looking at. And I'm not saying that AI is not a threat. And I'm not saying that there shouldn't be like consent and compensation for usage of voice. But I don't think it is going to put actors out of work tomorrow or the next day. I think as long as everyone focuses on their craft and being as truthful of a human as possible, then AI can never be you. There's no way. We still hire human actors to play robots when we could have generated that voice for years. So I get it, but I really don't think it's like today's threat. I don't mean that we shouldn't regulate against certain uses and make sure that there is consent and compensation in the process, and that people shouldn't be reading their contracts and making sure that they understand what they sign. But putting too much energy into this topic and not allowing also like the government and the rest of the world to kind of catch up and help regulate as well, I think is not doing the subject a positive service. Sure.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, I think certainly from a voice acting, and I've worked a lot with, AI voices. I try and stay up with it, and I've listened to a million AI voices, and still you can pick an AI voice out any time. You can see, you can sense an AI character, you can sense all of that stuff. And I think there's still, like you said, there's a long way to go before that starts to actually feel human and doesn't just feel like AI. That uncanny valley is still a pretty broad chasm at this point.
But do you know what is realistic? And I think it's important to bring this up too, is we talked about how sometimes there's 3,000 lines and vocal stress, right? So there is a world in which they are able to record 1,000 lines with you and use their engine to generate the other 30,000 and compensate you for it without you having to come in.
So long as you're compensated. So long as you're compensated.
But I mean, absolutely. But that's still not they still have to bring you in. So I just think, again, it's important to know what's existed so you know what you're fighting, and so you know where the most realistic move forward is. And it's consent, compensation, check your contracts.
For sure. And that's always the best advice in AI world or not. Understanding what the contract that you're getting into, have a lawyer if you need to, but understand what you're consenting to is important for all of us. So let's bring it back. Let's bring it back to the human. If you've been voice acting for a little while and you're thinking, I'd like to be in the video games, where should the voice actor concentrate? Is it improvisation classes? Where do they gain the experience so that when they get that game audition, or they want to start trying to get those game auditions, where should they be prepared to focus their attention?
So what's really interesting about games is that a lot of times you are recording by yourself, but you're recording conversations. So actually the best place to be trained is in theater and in-person class.
Interesting.
Because you have to get so good at being able to hold that conversation with yourself and know what those responses are going to be. So improv is fab. It's amazing. But really, even more important to that is just being in person with people. And sometimes we may not have those means. So online is also good. We learned during a pandemic. It's important to have people to bounce off of and not do it all by yourself, because eventually you will have to go back into the booth and do the thing by yourself, but you'll have all of that energy and knowledge of how you are communicating with all of these different humans to kind of build off of.
Very similar advice that people would give if they're interested in animation. Doesn't feel all that different. Like I do a lot of audio drama work, and I've never been in the booth with another actor doing scene. We have to get into the headspace of what that scene entails and then act it and respond just out of the blue. So that's great advice. Great advice. Learning that interpersonal play.
And I think a lot of voice actors don't necessarily come in from an acting background, and that's totally okay. But I do think that sometimes with the kind of the voiceover industry, the acting piece gets left behind a little bit.
Right. And I think to that point, I think it's less about the sound of your voice and more what you can do with it. We certainly hear voice actors all the time that have really unusual and not classic, deep, announcer voices. It seems like there's been such a push away from that to just sound the way you sound. You just have to be able to act somebody else's words. The authenticity of it makes a huge difference.
Yeah, and I think with casting, we find that a lot too. I mean, that's probably what we run into the most is on a numbers game. Let's say I have 100 auditions come in for a role, which is not unusual. At least 50% are going to be not on the right tone or to sound like commercial or some other genre that is not games. Right. At least 50%, usually closer to like 60. So, and then like 30 will be like, okay, I think I can probably choose from these 30. And then we narrow down to 7 to 12.
I think that goes along probably with a lot of it, that 80-20 rule. 80% of it is just doesn't sound right, didn't interpret it right, didn't have the vibe right, wasn't right. Just wasn't right. Yeah, for sure. Is there anything else that we need to talk about with respect to voice acting? I'm sure there's a lot that we could talk about for voice acting for video games, but I feel like this has been a very good sort of introductory primer that if you're interested in this world, getting the hang of the lingo, getting the hang of what to expect. Is there any other nuggets that we need to help people know to understand?
Yeah, and generally our auditions are a little bit slower. We want you to take your time.
You mean speaking slowly, not just waiting that it might be weeks before you hear back on the audition.
Both of those things are true.
Yeah.
Roles can take months and years to cast, and our development cycles are sometimes 5-7 years.
Is that right?
So if there's a game called Starfield coming out, and I did not work on it, but a lot of the actors are posting right now who are in it saying, I've been waiting 5 years to say this. I've been waiting 3 years to say this. So it's an investment, but it's a wonderful community, and it's a really fun place to play characters that you would otherwise may not be able to play.
For sure. Well, Julia, I want to thank you so much for your time today. I'm really grateful for all of the pearls of wisdom that you've shared with our audience. And could you just let us know where people can find you if they'd like to take the classes that you've mentioned? Where can people find you?
Sure. So you can find us at halpacademy.com. It's HALP academy.com. And then Game Soundcon is gamesoundcon.com. And that's on October 17th and 18th.
Great.
And we only have a handful of actor passes left because they're limited this year for the first year.
Okay.
So.
Does the actor pass? Does the online give access to the actor track?
It does to the classes, but obviously not the mixer.
Sure, of course. Well, I want to thank you so much for your time with us today, and thank you for sharing all of the information that you have. I'm so grateful for it, and I look forward to seeing you at the Game Soundcon.
Yes, I look forward to it. Thank you so much for your time and for all the really insightful questions. Happy to come back if anybody wants to learn more.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
Thank you.